Good day, everyone, especially to Dr. Ann Lorca. This is Maria Hazel R. Tecson, a MAED student major in teaching biology. In this video, I'll be talking about the context of education changes in the pre and post COVID 19 pandemic. And I am tasked to look for international studies or journals since its global scope. For the focus targets of this study would include the following. First is to describe. This is the main focus target of this report, to describe the context of education global before, which means during the face-to-face time, and what is happening now, how the pandemic changed the current situation. And the other two focus targets would include the international journals that I have chosen based on the topic that's given to me. And I mean, based on the main focus target that I have stated a while ago. So the first international journal that I have chosen is entitled Evaluating Pre and Post COVID 19 Learning, an empirical study of learners' perception in higher education. And the next one is how the COVID 19 pandemic is changing education, a perspective from Saudi Arabia. For the topic outline, I'll be including the following. First is a brief introduction of the context of education before versus now. I would be including here, I would differentiate the face-to-face learning versus the modes of learning that we have right now at present due to the COVID 19 pandemic, which is the distance or remote learning. And the other would be all about the first international journal that I have chosen. It includes pre-pandemic blended learning versus the post-pandemic web-assisted learning. And the next international journal would include pre-pandemic preparedness of participating OECD countries and non-OECD countries, and comparing it with the result of the survey from Saudi Arabia. And another one is the post-pandemic survey, which means how did this participating countries, which of course includes the Saudi Arabia, responded to the COVID 19 pandemic in the context of education. So right now, let's start with a brief introduction of the topic assigned to me, which is the context of education, changes in the pre and post COVID 19 pandemic. So in this introduction, I'll be talking about the context of education before, which is the traditional face-to-face learning, and now, which is the distance learning. So traditional face-to-face learning is also known as in-person teaching, which is conducted, by definition, conducted synchronously in a physical learning environment, meaning that traditionally the students are in the same place simultaneously. So we're talking about the classroom setup wherein the teacher and the students are carrying out the teaching learning process in person, which is why it's also called as in person. Okay. The other one, of course, the mode of learning right now during the COVID 19 pandemic, which is what we call as distance or remote learning. It would include online learning, modular learning, or even the combination of the two, which is the blended learning. So it's also called as the distance education or e-learning and online learning. So as we all know, due to the pandemic and the worldwide shutdown, transitioning to distance education at lightning speed became a necessity. So it's already given that, of course, because of the pandemic, as one of our expressions, famous expression here in the Philippines, agad-agad, right? So at a lightning speed, right away from traditional face-to-face learning, we are transitioning into distance or remote learning. Excuse me. So by definition, distance learning is a form of education in which the main elements include physical separation of teachers and students during instruction, and the use of various technologies to facilitate student to teacher and student to student communication. So it's very self-explanatory. However, talking about this distance learning, there are a lot of challenges to overcome. One of it would be the having unstable or having unstable internet connection. And aside from that is that some students also doesn't have the capability of reaching out through online discussion, especially if they doesn't have any gadgets like mobile phones or laptops to use in participate in digital learning. So the question is how pandemic changed the context of education. So countries used a variety of remote learning resources in order to continue students' learning during school closure. So across the globe, there are a lot of measures that each country have used or have done in order to continue the learning of our students. So some might have radio and television education. Some might have instructional self-learning packages or self-learning kits, and some might have or might opt to online instructional resources. So a lot of online platforms were used nearly in all OECD and partner countries. This would include educational content for exploring, real-time lessons on virtual meeting platforms, just like what we were doing in CTU. We have synchronous classes, right? Um, online support services for parents and students, and self-paced formalized lessons, which here in our country we're calling it as modules, right? Next is that okay, so before the pandemic hit, there's according to OECD in 2017, on average across OECD countries, 11% of public expenditure was devoted to education before the pandemic. But the question there is, as the pandemic affected the world in a global scope, of course, it would also mean that it would affect the public spending of our government on education, as of course funds are being diverted to health sectors and of the economy as well. So this is another challenge. This is another thing that pandemic have changed the context of education. So not just with how the modes of learning has been done, might as well as the budget allocation, right? So some countries have introduced short-term support measures, just like supplying digital learning devices, financial support to students and schools, funds for safety and cleaning equipment. So the next one is this chart from UNESCO. The source of this is from UNESCO, and it's actually charted by Statista, and I got this from Forbes, and it shows how the COVID-19 um, impacted the how it impacts the a number of learners by national school closures worldwide. So this shows staggering impact on global education by starting February to March 2020. So it affected or it impacted 1.38 billion by March 2020 due to the closure of the schools. And of course, it's all because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So moving on to the research journals, the international journals that I have chosen. Let's have first the first research article, which is entitled Evaluating Pre and Post COVID 19 Learning, an empirical study of learners' perception in higher education. This is actually done. The authors are Anamika Sharma and Iram Alvi in January 2021. So, in the present times, according to Gupta in 2020, due to the exceptional situation of COVID-19, the education pedagogy and the mode of teaching learning methodologies are to be changed overnight. Do you agree with this? Yes, of course, because we need to shift into another mode of learning, another educational pedagogy because of these challenging times given to us by the pandemic, by the COVID-19 pandemic. So, this study would include pre-pandemic blended learning versus post-pandemic web-assisted ways of e-learning. You might wonder why I am in this study have included set or considered blended learning as pre-pandemic mode of learning. Well, I think it is because in India, blended learning is already applied prior to the pandemic. So even before the pandemic, there's already blended learning that has been applied in India, which is why setting it as a pre-pandemic mode of learning and contrasting it with the post-pandemic and their mode of learning there in India during the pandemic is the web-assisted ways of e-learning. So purely online learning. So this e-learning would include the use of internet, websites, telecommunication, radio, video recording, or video, or what you call this, synchronous meetings, just like the Google Meet, using Google Meet or Zoom meetings, right? So for the objective of the study, this paper investigates it investigates and evaluates the learner's perception in a higher education institution, HEI of India, and compares the difference in the perception of the same students in the pre and post COVID-19 period. It would include few aspects of learning which are the flexibility, personalization, sufficiency, and accessibility, usability, content quality, providing guidance services, instructors' attitude, instructors' enthusiasm, instructors' responsiveness, instructors' interactive communication. Excuse me. So this is the significant findings of this study or of this journal. In this table, it shows the descriptive statistics of pre and post-pandemic learning. So there are a lot of numbers here, but what I wanted to highlight is the median score for the post and the pre-pandemic learning. So as you can see there, the median of post-pandemic is 31 and the median for pre-pandemic is 40. A noteworthy significant difference was observed in the students' pre-pandemic learning scores having the median of 40 compared with post-pandemic score having a median of 31, which showed that students' perception excuse me, about pre-pandemic learning was more favorable in comparison with the post-pandemic. So students had significantly higher perception. So this study or the results showed that the students had significantly higher perception of the pre-pandemic learning, which indicated that they had more affirmative opinions about the blended e-learning. Sorry. A possible explanation is that, as we all know, this is not just applicable to students in India, but globally speaking, it was the first time that the learners globally had experienced this mode of learning, right? Particularly those students from India. So it is possible that students didn't have enough time to get used to the new and novel methods being adopted by the teachers. So basically, it would need a huge, I mean, enough or sufficient time for them to adapt or to adjust with these methods, with these new and novel methods of learning during the COVID-19 pandemic. So as the conclusion, the findings confirmed that blended e-learning methods are perceived better than the web-assisted e-learning methods by the students. For the recommendation, future work may also provide useful insight into the mitigating effects of other variables, such as, for example, we have gender, we have age, family background, cultural background, and many other variables to include on which affects the student's perception of learning. Because as we all know, all of these things, all of these factors, or all of these variables would affect the learning of our students, especially during the time of pandemic. Okay, so moving on to the next international journal. It's entitled How the COVID-19 Pandemic is Changing Education, a Perspective from Saudi Arabia. And this study was done by Anthony Mann, Marcus Schwab, Parlo Fraser, Gabor Fulop, and Grace Adoli Ansa in 2020. This is actually in partnership with OECD and the Ministry of Education and the National E-Learning Center in Saudi Arabia. But before we move on to this article, let's try to let's try to know more first about the OECD. What does OECD stands for? It stands for Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. It is actually an association of 38 nations in Europe, the Americas, and the Pacific. So it aims to help member countries formulate economic and social policies for the betterment or for the development of these nations and other countries as well, most particularly the developing countries outside membership, and it promotes reform. So as you can see there in a simple pie chart, the members and key partners represent 80% of the world trade, making this article or making this journal a very significant one, particularly in the focus target number 1, right? Because it doesn't just talk about one country. It includes a survey from different countries, different member countries of OECD, and non-OECD countries as well, aside from the Saudi Arabia. So making this or expecting this journal quite long. Okay, so for the objective of the study, this paper focuses on Saudi Arabia and draws on comparative international data to explore how well the country was prepared to deal with educational consequences of the virus and how it was dealt with school closure. So basically, it's focuses more on how prepared is Saudi Arabia and other countries according to the survey of OECD before or prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, and how did it respond? How did these countries responded to the school closures due to the COVID-19 pandemic? So it includes 27 OECD countries and 9 non-OECD countries. So the analysis of this journal draws on 2018 OECD international surveys of school principals. So it's actually a survey before the pandemic hit, and it includes survey of school principals from TALIS, or the Teaching and Learning International Survey. And the second, for the school students, we have the PISA, or the Program for International Student Assessment. And of course, lastly is the second OECD Harvard questionnaire on education responses to COVID-19, completed by senior government officials in 36 countries in April to May 2020. Okay, so these are the two comparison groups that are included in this journal. We have 27 OECD countries here. We have Austria, Belgium, Canada, and many others. And 9 non-OECD countries, which includes Brazil, Costa Rica, Jamaica, Georgia, Dominican Republic, and many others. So these are the participating countries for the second OECD Harvard survey. And for the TALIS and the PISA, it would also include participating OECD countries and non-OECD countries as well. So this in this study, it's divided into two parts. Excuse me. So for the part 1, it would include how well prepared was the education in Saudi Arabia for the pandemic. So it sets out an international comparative evidence on how well the education system in Saudi Arabia was prepared to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic and consequential school closures. And the data here are drawn from OECD TALIS and PISA surveys, both which were undertaken in 2019. So basically, it's prior to the crisis or prior to the pandemic. And part 2 is it includes how the education system in Saudi Arabia responded to the pandemic. So it sets out the international comparative evidence on how the education system in Saudi Arabia has responded to the COVID-19 pandemic and consequential school closures. So if the part 1 is all about how prepared was the Saudi Arabia and other countries, OECD and non-OECD countries, for the part 2, it's more on how these countries responded. So the part 1 is more on the part 2 is more on reactive side of the education to the pandemic, and the other one is how prepared it is. Okay. So it's more on the proactive side. I forgot the term. It's more on the proactive side for the part 1, and for the part 2, it's more on the reactive side of these countries included in this study in the context of education. Okay, so for the first part, it would talk about, of course, during the pre-pandemic times, right? So for the significant findings, it would include teachers' preparedness for ICT-based teaching prior to the crisis. How prepared are the teachers? Second is the school and student preparedness for ICT-based learning prior to the crisis. So it's more on how prepare the students and the school prior to the pandemic, students' home settings for online learning prior to the crisis. Are the home settings of the students ready for the COVID-19 shift of mode of learning, which is the e-learning or the blended learning? And students' attitudes towards self-directed learning prior to the crisis, how motivated they are to learn by themselves before the crisis, and the parental support and assistance as well. So all of these things are included in the part 1, which are of course very important, especially in the shift of the modes of learning due to the pandemic, right? Okay, so let's have the first one, teachers' preparedness. This is a good starting point to assess the extent to which teachers and their students were prepared for school closure is to examine how frequently these technologies were used in the classroom. How frequently are these technologies being used in the classroom before the crisis hit? So exactly, are really these what do you call this? Are really these countries well prepared in terms of the usage of ICT before even before the crisis hit? So that's a good portion, a good thing to consider in order to know how well prepared were the educational system in these countries for the pandemic, right? So as you can see there in the figure, for the first part, teachers who report that they frequently or always let the students use ICT for projects or classwork. Actually, by the way, the data was from the Talis, and it showed there that there's 53 for OECD for the average of OECD countries, and 49 for Saudi Arabia, the one in green circle. The one in blue circle, that's OECD, and for gray circles, those are non-OECD countries. So, as you can see there, there's 73 and 56 for teachers whom the use of ICT for teaching was included in their formal education or training. And the other one is teachers who feel they can support student learning through the use of digital technology quite a bit or a lot. It's also quite high. Just like with the next one, which is teachers for whom ICT skills for teaching were included in their professional development activities, just like in graduate school, for instance. And the last one, having a lower score, a lower percentage, is that teachers reporting a high level of need for professional development in ICT skills for teaching. So as you can see there in the figure, these countries are quite prepared in terms of their teachers' preparedness for ICT-based teaching even before the crisis hit or even before the pandemic hit. So making it the last part of this figure obvious, having a lower score or a lower percentage wherein there's a need. So meaning, basically it means that these countries doesn't have a high level of need for professional development in terms of ICT skills for teaching. Okay, so next is the school and student preparedness for ICT-based learning prior to crisis. So the implementation of ICT in school also requires the availability of sufficient resources from the school for its access and use. Not just from the school, might as well as from the students personal access, right? Do they have these resources at their personal use, readily available for ICT-based learning? And it's also, the data was from the TALIS, both the TALIS and the PISA, because it includes the student and the school. So it includes the principal's views on which school resource issues hinder the capacity to deliver high quality instruction, can shed light on possible impediments to the wider use of ICT teaching in school. So in this part about the principal's view, we have the first two part of the figure wherein it shows that principals reporting that the shortage or inadequacy of digital technology for hinder hinder the school's capacity to provide quality instruction quite a bit or a lot. So as you can see here, it's the Saudi Arabia have a quite high percentage in this portion, and the OECD on average have quite low. So it basically means that the school doesn't have adequate digital technology for instruction, making it a hindrance to schools' capacity in providing quality instruction, right? So the next part or the next portion is principals reporting that insufficient internet access hinder the school's capacity to provide the quality instruction quite a bit or a lot. So for the next portion, it's more on the internet connectivity. So for the Saudi Arabia, the figure shows that the country doesn't have doesn't have a serious problem with regards to the internet connection, having a higher percentage compared with the OECD average, which is only 19. And for the third part, students in schools whose principal agreed or strongly agreed that the effective online learning support platform is available. So it's just on the average portion. The availability um, the availability of effective online learning support platform is just on the middle portion, having 49 for the Saudi Arabia and 54 for the OECD, average OECD participating countries. Excuse me. So students in school, next part is students in schools whose principal agreed or strongly agreed that effective professional resources for teachers to learn how to use digital devices are available. So it's quite high for this portion, having 66 and 65 for 66 for Saudi Arabia and 65 for OECD. And meanwhile, for the other economy or other countries, it's quite dispersing. It has variation, maybe from country to country. I don't know, but it's not specified here which country is which, right? So the next one is students in schools whose principal agreed or strongly agreed that teachers have sufficient time to prepare lessons integrating digital devices. So in terms of sufficient time, as you can see, Saudi Arabia and OECD countries, participating countries, doesn't have really a serious problem with this regarding this matter. So basically, all in all, in terms of school and student preparedness for ICT-based learning, for me in this part, there's not quite much of a problem, most particularly for Saudi Arabia. But for the OECD, it's more on the instruction effectivity, adequacy of digital technology and the internet access, having a very low percentage, having 25 and 19 only, right? As we have discussed. So next is the home settings. This is another factor to consider for online learning. So prior to the crisis, this was from the PISA. The conditions for creating an adequate climate for homeschooling not only rely to access on technology and the internet, right? But also on whether an appropriate physical space for learning exists at home. Is there a conducive environment or conducive space at home, physical space at home, appropriate for online learning or not? So this figure answers that question. For the first part, students who report to have a computer they can use for schoolwork. So as you can see there, there's not much of a problem in terms of having computer or devices to use for online learning for both the Saudi Arabia and the OECD, the average for OECD participating countries. But for the next part, it's quite low for Saudi Arabia. It's about students who report to have a computer they can use for schoolwork. Okay, so it's the bottom quartile by student socio-economic profile. And for the next part, students who report to have a quiet place to study. So as you can see there, most of the OECD countries have a higher percentage in terms of the higher percentage in terms of this part. A quiet place to study for the students, having 85 for Saudi Arabia and 91 for the OECD average countries. And the next one is students who report to have a quiet place to study. Okay, so that's the bottom quartile of student socio-economic status. So as you can see there, on average, for me, Saudi Arabia, based on the figure shown, Saudi Arabia and OECD participating countries doesn't have any problem with the home settings of the student, preparedness of the students in terms of their environment, physical space for learning at home. Okay, so the next part is the student's attitude towards self-directed learning. So this is another important factor to consider, right? How motivated are the students in learning on their own, not anymore with the guidance of this, not anymore the physical guidance and the pressure given by the allotted schedule during the face-to-face period, right? And of course, their resilience, their levels of resilience and self-efficacy, on their confidence, on their ability to pursue their goals in the face of the challenging situation given by the or brought by the crisis. So it's just like the previous part, it's the data was from the PISA. And for the first part, it shows students who agree or strongly agree that their belief in themselves gets them through hard times. So that's quite high. That's quite high percentage, having 86% for Saudi Arabia and 71% for OECD participating countries. And same goes with the next two parts. For the first one, they strongly agree or strongly agree that they usually manage one way or another. So they can manage their self-learning, self-directed learning. And that and the next portion is that trying hard at school is important. They agree that trying hard at school is important, making a good, giving importance to school works, right? And the next part, the last part, is that students think it is very true or extremely true that their goal in school is to learn as much as possible. So for this portion, um, goal in school is to learn as much as possible. For this portion, it's quite low for the OECD, average OECD, for the average of the OECD participating countries, and just on the average for the Saudi Arabia. So for me, again, for this portion, for figure 5, both Saudi Arabia and the OECD, average of OECD participating countries are quite prepared in terms of their attitude towards self-directed learning even before the crisis. And lastly is the parental assistance and support. So as we all know, students need the support of their parents to engage with their learning and reduce anxiety in these stressful times. This is a great factor to in pursuing online mode of learning or learning on their own, right? We need the students need parental support and assistance. This is most especially true with the modular mode of learning, right? Because it's already the parents who would serve as the teachers of the students during this time. So, but in this part, it would talk about how the parental support and assistance existed according to the students from PISA and from the teachers from TALIS, the student prior to the pandemic. Okay, so for the first part, students who agree or strongly agree that their parents support their educational efforts and achievements. So it's quite relative with both Saudi Arabia and OECD participating countries. The results showed quite high. And for the next part, it's very low, that students for whom the language used at home most of the time is different from the language of the test. Okay, so basically, it's just the same. Having a low percentage of the result here, it simply means that it's the language being used at home is the same language from the language that is being used in the test. So this gives us another positive feedback or another positive result of the survey in terms of the parental support and assistance. The next part is teachers reporting a high level of need for professional development in teacher-parent-guardian cooperation. So it's low, which means that the teachers doesn't need a high level of professional development in terms of teacher to parent or guardian cooperation. Okay. So the last one is the average number of hours teachers report having spent on communication and cooperation with parents or guardians during the most recent complete calendar week. So this is from TALIS. As you can see, the OECD participating countries have an average of 1.4 hours, and for the Saudi Arabia has an average of 2.2 hours, number of hours, in terms of communication and cooperation with the parents or guardians. So basically, this figure showed another way to say that these countries in this study or in this research is prepared for the crisis, is prepared prior to the crisis, I mean. Okay, so the next portion or the next part of this study of this journal is talks about how the education system in Saudi Arabia responded to the pandemic. So it's more on the reactive side already, talking about the post-pandemic period, right? So it would include instructional time lost. As we all know, this is very obvious, a very obvious aspect or a very obvious part of the post-pandemic or during the school closures due to COVID-19 pandemic. Another one is the alternative learning opportunities during school closures, responsibilities for alternative learning opportunities. Who are responsible for the alternative learning opportunities? Is it from the Ministry of Education or from the government, from the president, from the what you call this, the prime minister? Or another one is the delivery of alternative learning opportunities. How was it delivered? And the next is the instructional resources that are being used. Is it radio and television, or is it online platforms, online learning platforms, or is it self-learning kits or the modules? And next is the equity in access. Do everyone or do all of the teachers and students got the same opportunities according to their needs? And lastly is the evaluation of the strategy for education continuity. Okay, so respondents to the second OECD Harvard survey were asked to estimate what percentage of students accessed the curriculum during the most recent week when it was not possible to attend school through various means of education continuity. So as you can see there, support from teachers in OECD and non-OECD countries have a higher percentage, and it's actually 0% for Saudi Arabia, and support through other means would be 0% for OECD countries, and non-OECD countries have 25% and 30% for Saudi Arabia. And support from teachers and through other means, the combination of the first two level of support, it's actually 70% of the Saudi Arabia. So majority of it would be the level of support would be from the teachers, both from the teachers and through other means for the Saudi Arabia. And for the OECD and non-OECD countries, we have 56% and 45%, 45% and 56% respectively. So for no support, it's 0% with OECD countries, and for Saudi Arabia, and there's actually a 10% for non-OECD countries having no support. Okay, so the next one is which instructional resources have been used to support the academic experience of students while they were unable to come to school. So there are a lot of resources being used here. It includes instructional packages. We have the printouts, worksheets, textbooks, modules. So for OECD, it's quite high. It's a quite high percentage for OECD countries and non-OECD countries. And for Saudi Arabia, it's just, the answer is it's not in percentage, but it's just a yes. For radio education, it's an average for both OECD and non-OECD countries. And for Saudi Arabia, it was not being used. And for educational television and existing online instructional resources and online instruction delivered by the same teachers of the students learning, it's a yes for all of the three, for OECD countries, non-OECD countries, and for Saudi Arabia. And it's quite low for online instruction provided by private tutors for OECD countries and non-OECD countries, and it's a yes for Saudi Arabia. And for other modalities, for Saudi Arabia, it means that there are no other modalities that are being used. But for the OECD and non-OECD countries, there are 28 and 33 So basically, all of these instructional resources are being used. It's just the last two instructional resource, which is from the private tutors, and the other modalities that are being used in a low percentage. Okay, so when asked to estimate how effective their strategy for education continuity was compared to what students normally learn in schools, almost half of all respondents indicated that it is not possible to know, and 32% indicated that students learned but less than they would have normally learned in school. So basically, a majority, since almost half, not really majority, but almost half of all respondents agreed that it is not possible to know as to how effective is the strategy for education continuity during the crisis was for the students, and there's only 32% saying that the students have learned, but it's not the same with what they have learned normally in a school setup during face-to-face. Okay, so the next one is the respondents to the second OECD Harvard survey were split with respect to whether the focus of the curriculum during the strategy for education continuity was similar to or different from what normally happens in school. So as you can see there, the highest score among all of these factors is more on the focus. The focus was on fewer subjects than is normally the case in school. So there's a majority let's have first for the OECD countries agreeing with the similarity of what it is when it's in face to face, in comparing it with what we have about the focus of the curriculum, what we have at present during the crisis. It's much a higher percentage for this part. But it's quite high as well for the focus on fewer subjects than is normally in the case in school. But for the non-OECD countries, it showed here in this table that majority agreed that the focus was on fewer subjects rather than having the same amount of teaching and focus that's similar to what happens in school during face-to-face. And the same goes with Saudi Arabia, saying yes, that they would agree that yes, during the COVID-19 pandemic, the focus of the curriculum was more on fewer subjects when you compare it with the face-to-face, traditional face-to-face mode of learning. Okay, so that's all for the significant findings of this study for this international journal. For the conclusion, looking more broadly, responses from Saudi Arabia are very much in line with those from the other non-OECD countries which respond to the survey. So comparing practice in Saudi Arabia during the pandemic to that in OECD and non-OECD countries, as you can see in the significant findings that we have discussed earlier, it's very similar results are observed with one significant exception, which is Saudi Arabia was one of a very few countries which provided teaching staff with funds to undertake courses related to professional development as part of the response to the pandemic. So for the recommendation, it may be advisable in Saudi Arabia to collate the perspectives of school teachers and principals, and that recommendation for reopening plans contemplate making time to analyze the lessons learned during the lockdown, which includes to identify effective mitigation strategies for future closures, learn from the experience of other countries, update emergency planning for large-scale closures, investing in creation of effective e-learning platforms, and providing professional development for teachers for effective e-learning instruction. Okay, so it's much more on the lessons learned rather than calling it as a recommendation. Okay, so for the next, for the summary, in a nutshell, for the first journal, evaluating pre and post COVID-19 learning, an empirical study of learners' perception. So, to summarize it all, there exists a statistically significant difference in the students' perception towards pre-pandemic and post-pandemic learning methods, which indicates that students have a higher perception of the pre-pandemic blended learning than that of the post-pandemic learning web-assisted learning. Okay, so in this research or this journal may help empower policymakers, educators, and administrators of universities and colleges by revealing the students' perception of learning. So for the second international journal entitled How the COVID-19 Pandemic is Changing Education, a Perspective from Saudi Arabia. So for this part, it simply showed that the pandemic required teachers to work in new ways, teaching online and adapting teaching styles to a lockdown world. So opportunities exist to enhance collaboration and digital skills through delivering greater levels of professional development through online courses and seminars. Okay, so another one, another summary for both of the articles. For me, both of the articles that I have chosen, that we have discussed in this video, are important in determining at a closer look, in my own perspective, as to how the pandemic change or affects the context of education, especially in the countries where some students without reliable internet access or technology struggle to participate in digital learning. And lastly, agreeably, today the educational context before the pandemic, which is during the face-to-face time, provides the students and also the teachers much better teaching and learning experiences and even outcomes. So it simply says that I truly agree that the educational context during the traditional face-to-face, it's much more better when you compare it with what we have right now at present during the pandemic or during the crisis. Okay, so these are my references, and these are the two articles that I got, and these are my e-sources from the internet. Okay, so that ends my presentation for this video. I hope you have learned something from this short or brief discussion of these of the context of education, how the pandemic changed the education system. The context of education. Thank you everyone for listening and have a great day.